The funding for this program is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Friends of 4, 10, and 12.
City officials in Boise have made emergency repairs to City Hall, correcting damage caused by last week's earthquake, and City Hall is open again. Meanwhile, in central Idaho today, the earthquake cleanup continues. Tonight, we look at some of the questions that remain. Good evening. Boise City officials completed some quick repairs on the City Hall building in downtown Boise today, allowing city workers to go back to their jobs and allowing that building to reopen to the public. The City Hall building was closed down about midday yesterday when it was discovered that a key support beam on the second floor of the four-story building was dangerously close to collapse. The damage, of course, is blamed on last Friday's powerful earthquake centered in central Idaho. Meanwhile, today in Custer County, the area hardest hit by the quake, cleanup efforts have resumed following a pause yesterday for the funeral for the second of two children killed during that earthquake last Friday. And today, some new problems associated with the most powerful earthquake to rock the United States in nearly 25 years, those problems just being uncovered. Tonight, we look at some of the problems and the questions that remain in the aftermath of this earthquake. We'll look at the question, including, among others, whether we should be preparing for another major earthquake in Idaho. We'll look at the question of what the problems at the Boise City Hall say about Idaho building codes. In light of earthquakes, are they adequate? And what has happened to the important subsurface water that so many Idahoans depend upon? We begin tonight, though, with an update on the earthquake aftermath in the most affected area, Custer County. And that update comes tonight from the state's top disaster services official, General James Brooks. General, just right off the top, what problems are you most concerned about in that Custer County area tonight?
Mark, the first concern that we all had were for people problems, to be sure that they were not homeless, that there were no injured that had not been found. And I think we're convinced that the people problems have been pretty well looked after. There are a lot of damage problems that we're concerned with now. The governor needs all of the statistical information that he can get with respect to both the physical damage and the possible economic impact in the area in order to make his decision on requesting a presidential declaration of a major disaster. All of my people and all of state agencies are now involved in gathering those details, mostly through damage assessments. I think one of the greatest concerns to the people in the Mackay area has been the dam. It has been inspected and it will continue to be inspected, and as much as we know is that the dam is safe and it's sound. But this is a very great concern to the people in the area, and we're paying special attention to that. I intend to be in the area tomorrow myself to conduct some public meetings to try and inform the people as to what we're doing, because there's not too much media coverage in Custer County, and we find that people have a difficult time finding out what is being done.
Is that causing you some problem? They're feeling that not enough is being done?
I think that's possible, and I think there's just a dearth of information in the community, and we want to try and assure them that we are seeking aid from all of the programs that might be available.
Let me just ask you quickly, General, about two things that continue to be on some people's mind. First, you mentioned the people problem. One of the concerns last Friday and throughout the weekend was hunters who might have been in the area. Are you satisfied that those people are no reason to be concerned about hunters?
I'm satisfied. We work with the sheriff, and families that are concerned about friends and family members that are hunting always go to the sheriff when they don't show up, and we have no indication of lost hunters.
Okay, and the other thing is a wire service report that I saw today that apparently some National Guard personnel are doing that damage assessment that you suggested, looking to see what, whether buildings should that have been severely damaged, whether they should come down or whether they should remain.
We're looking at it to determine whether or not the National Guard has the capability of tearing them down. They're all privately owned, and of course any decision on what's done must involve the owner himself. We're up there today to assess the problem and see if we have a capability of contributing to the solution. I expect a report from my people tomorrow morning.
General, just finally, has your response and the state's ability to respond to this situation been hampered by a lack of, well, money, I guess?
At this stage in the game, I don't believe so. I think every state agency has responded with the people they have, and I think they did it in a very timely manner. The governor and I got to Chalice at 2 p.m. last Friday. The emergency medical services people had already been there for 4 hours. And I believe we responded timely, and to date, there's been no money spent, in a sense, because we haven't determined entirely what needs to be done.
We'll come back, sir. Thank you. Let's turn now to our first major question tonight. Should we be preparing for another major Idaho earthquake? Some thoughts on that from Professor Spencer Wood, an associate professor of geophysics at Boise State University and one of the close watchers of last Friday's Central Idaho earthquake. We have some pictures that I think you took up there when? Over the weekend or last Friday?
Well, we took them last
Wood?
Friday afternoon and also
I
Saturday.
think you can see them over there. We'll go by fairly quickly, so if you can describe them quickly.
Okay, I'll explain what we're looking at. This is the road going west over Double Springs Well. We've now just gone to the water in the Thousand Springs Valley, which is much higher, much larger than it was before, and there's a great flow going down through the valley. This is a sand volcano crater. All that white stuff you see up there is newly erupted sand that's come from the subsurface during the ground went quick during the earthquake and erupted sand over quite an area by Chili Buttes.
Okay. Just a quick sample of some of the effects there. You were predicting yesterday another major quake in perhaps a matter of weeks or months, right?
Well, I don't like it phrased quite that way. We're predicting a normal aftershock sequence from this earthquake. We don't expect any earthquakes larger than the one that occurred, and we would consider something like a magnitude 6 earthquake to be very likely. This one had a magnitude 6.9. A magnitude 6 earthquake is one that is 30 times less in its energy than the main shock that occurred. But it's very reasonable to anticipate that thing for the next 3 or 4 months.
It's reasonable on the basis of what? Just historical performance of earthquakes? I see.
Yeah, well, if we look at the earthquake history and record elsewhere in the western United States, in the Basin and Range, and around the world, these things typically have 1 or 2 large aftershocks. We have had magnitude 5 aftershocks. And let me put it this way, a magnitude 6 earthquake in the next few weeks is a reasonable thing, but it may not occur. But it's a reasonable thing to occur. We cannot predict very accurately what aftershocks are going to occur. We can only look historically at other earthquakes and say, yes, they have occurred after other earthquakes of magnitude 6.9.
What would a magnitude 6 earthquake do should it occur?
Well, a magnitude 6 earthquake in that particular area would not have any great effect except on structures that were already weakened by the earthquake. And that's why it's important not to occupy buildings that have been perceived or found to be structurally unsound.
So that would be a particularly significant thing in the city of Mackay.
Oh, absolutely. In the city of Mackay and in any of the surrounding towns within 70 or 80 miles, if there have been major structural weaknesses that were developed during the main quake.
Rule of thumb, how long will these aftershocks continue after an earthquake of this magnitude?
Well, we would anticipate any of the larger aftershocks, the ones above magnitude 5, to happen mostly within the year. However, we will have a great many small magnitude 3 and 4 earthquakes in that area probably for several years. And the aftershock sequence probably will wind down after 8 or 10 years. This is a big earthquake, and that typically happens.
A lot of folks are wondering, I'm sure, about all of this earthquake activity that seems to be coming in a spurt since last Friday. I see on the wire that there's another, University of Utah saying another earthquake measuring 3.6 on the Richter scale in western Wyoming, about 10 miles west of Jackson, just today. Are any of these related?
Well, I would say a magnitude 3.6 just west of Jackson is the normal state of affairs for that area around Yellowstone National Park in Jackson. They have them. That is a so to speak, seismic hot spot. It's one that we get a lot of earthquakes from here with our seismographs in Boise, and it's well known, much better known than was the west side of the Lost River Range.
Okay, let me ask you the tough question finally. Are people concerned enough about this?
Yes, I think that we've responded reasonably well. I think that the real thing we have to realize here in Boise is that Mackay is a very tiny town, and there's a number of very small farms and livelihoods up there that have been affected. Only a small number of people, which aren't a large political vote. Nevertheless, their problems are real, and I think they have to be perceived by government down here in Boise.
Well, let me just go briefly on that point back to General Brooks. General, I guess my question would be, is the state prepared, should we have this sort of major aftershock that Professor Wood talks about?
It's difficult to say, are you prepared? I don't suppose anybody's ever really prepared for an earthquake. But I would say this, state government is prepared to react with all of the assets and the capabilities they have to whatever problems may arise. And I can assure you that Governor Evans is intensely interested in not only what has happened, but the best predictions for what might happen. He is very preparedness conscious, and he expects all of us to stay prepared to react with whatever assets we have. Should this occur again in the Custer County area or elsewhere in the state.
Professor Wood, should we be worried tonight about taking those buildings down that could be further damage should there be a significant aftershock?
I don't see the urgency for taking the buildings down, but there is urgency to keep people out of them. I myself think that the buildings left in Mackay would be a marvelous tourist attraction if we had any way you could preserve some of those brick buildings and keep them safe from people that would like to view them. That tends to be a real reaction to damage, is to try to remove it as quickly as possible. But believe me, it's a very interesting thing to leave there also.
General Brooks, what's the status of that in terms of people not occupying those buildings or trying to quickly reoccupy them?
Well, we took all of the precautions we could last weekend to be sure that people did not occupy those that were unsafe. I'm receiving requests from local officials up there to address the issue of how do we remove them. And I expect there'll be considerable pressure to how do we get rid of these unsafe facilities.
Okay, well, gentlemen, we'll come back. Thank you. Let's turn now to question number 2 tonight, relating to building codes and whether they are in Idaho adequate after such a major earthquake. Boise City officials are wondering that very same thing today now that they've made some hurried repairs, as I mentioned earlier, to City Hall. Boise City Building Department Director Tim Hoagland explained the problems at City Hall today to producer Gary Richardson.
We had a beam on the second floor actually move off of the seat on the column, and it moved to a point where there was only about 1/4 of an inch of bearing surface left, and we were really concerned that if we had an aftershock of any magnitude that it could move that additional 1/4 of an inch, and then that beam would come down and hit the first floor and could even carry right on down to the basement. So what we did, we put some supports in. We had an I-beam put in between the first and second floor to support the beam that just had the 1/4 inch of bearing, and then we went down the basement and supported directly underneath that I-beam, one from the basement up to the first floor beam. So we have support now coming from the basement on up. This is a temporary measure, and we're having a cradle designed by a structural engineer, and we'll have that installed on the column probably in the next few weeks, and then we'll remove this temporary measure.
Should people be concerned about other structural damage in the city?
I think everybody ought to take a look at their building, particularly the column and beam networks. If there's any cracking or any indication it's a problem, they probably should have an engineer take a look at it.
More on this question of building codes and the adequacy of them now following this earthquake, and for that assessment we go to Boise architect Ernie Lombard. Mr. Lombard, I know you're not directly informed or aware of that situation at Boise City Hall, but is there a lesson in what has happened there for us in light of what's happened with this earthquake?
Well, perhaps I think that you know, the design of buildings to resist seismic loading is at best you know, a inexact science. I think that what we know about how buildings react under an earthquake and so forth, you know, we're learning more and more about that sort of thing all the time. And actually, in Idaho, we really haven't been, it wasn't until 1959 and when they had the earthquakes over in Yellowstone Park and in eastern Idaho did we really get concerned with seismic design in the state of Idaho. And in 1964, the state of Idaho started actually enforcing seismic part of the Uniform Building Code in the different jurisdictions in the state where the Uniform Building Code was enforced.
But those are, of course, just for new buildings, not for old ones.
Right, that's exactly right. So we have kind of an interesting situation, I think, in the state in the fact that the Uniform Building Code, which is the code that you speak to new buildings being designed to, is only enforced by local option. In other words, many smaller communities, and I have no idea whether Mackay and Challis enforced the Uniform Building Code or not, but in many small communities that around the state, there really is no enforcement of any building code, Uniform Building Code or any other kind. For a couple years, the state of Idaho had a law requiring all the small communities, all communities, to enforce Uniform Building Code, and that was in effect for only 2 years, and then it was repealed, mainly because politicians caught a lot of flack from builders and people who wanted to do things their own way, and so consequently it was voted back out of law. So now it's all on a very much a local option kind of basis.
I see. Well, about this building in Boise here, the City Hall, it's barely 7 years old. Should there be some reason to believe, and I don't want to impugn anybody who had anything to do with that building, but a building that recently constructed, should it have been more securely constructed considering the earthquake situation?
Well, I think that you have to consider the fact that buildings, all buildings that are designed, for earthquake zones are designed really to have a certain amount of give and take in them. There's the fact that the beam didn't fail or it didn't fall down or didn't really have significant damage, I think probably says a lot for actually the building codes and following the building codes, and I'm sure that, reasonably sure that building meets, building codes. The current ones. There may be some question whether the current one is stiff enough, and I think in light of the current activity of this last earthquake being the major earthquake in the last 25 years, I would think that we really will probably see a change in what the code calls for Boise in particular, and most of Idaho. Most of Idaho right now is in seismic zone 2, which is it's a scale of like 1 to 4, and the Midwest, in places where there's very little earthquakes would be 1. We're a 2. Some of eastern Idaho is a 3, and quite a bit of California is a 3, and then certain areas of California, like around San Francisco and up around Anchorage, Alaska, would be a 4, which would be the worst case. And typically, a 3 zone would be twice the amount of seismic horizontal loading that, say, a 2 would be.
Well, just quickly, what would you advise anyone who is concerned about their building, or a public official or a private citizen for that matter? Should they be calling in someone to have a look if they have any concern?
Sure, I think so. I think that if there's any reason at all to be worried about whether your building sustained damage, you should have a structural engineer take a look at it. The buildings are designed to the only kind of buildings that are designed really to go through an earthquake with no damage would be like a nuclear reactor, and we all know what they cost to build. So there's a cost-benefit
Sure.
kind of thing to
Sure.
it, and so they're all, some damage, cracking, and that sort of thing could be very well expected.
Okay, well, let me just quickly go back to Professor Wood on a couple of these points. Should we be more concerned about the way we construct buildings in Idaho in light of what happened last Friday?
Oh yes, I think absolutely, although it's no surprise to geologists that we will have earthquakes like this. I'd like to point out that in 1972, a consulting firm for the Veterans Hospital rated that the 100-year earthquake could have accelerations up here of about 15% gravity, and we should expect in the maximum earthquake about a quarter G accelerations. It's not clear that the buildings in Boise, a great many of the public structures in Boise, could withstand what we would call the maximum credible earthquake, and I'm not even fully assured that we could withstand even 15% G with a good many of the older structures. So I think it's very important.
Structures not unlike many of the ones that collapsed in Mackay.
Certainly public buildings that have public occupancy, I think we all have a responsibility to see that those things are checked now that the interest is up and people may be willing to pay the $1,000 or so it takes for and I want to point out that it takes a structural engineer that's very experienced in seismic loading. Not all structural engineers have been, fully trained
Somebody
in
knows what
all
he's
the
doing.
problems.
Right.
You'll find some very good ones in the San Francisco area, certainly.
Right. Yeah. Just quickly, Mr. Lombard, on that point, as a practical matter, are there things that can be done to make these buildings more safe should the determination be made that they have to be made more safe or should be made more safe? I mean, can you do some things structurally?
You can do things structurally to existing buildings to make them more safe, yes, to make them be able to stand more lateral forces, that kind of thing. We could also, and I think it would be a good idea for Idaho to really be in Boise and this area to be in seismic zone 3 rather than 2. And just to give you an idea of what he's talking about in percent of gravity, seismic zone 2 would be 7% of gravity would be your horizontal loading. And if they're saying that the 100-year earthquake could have 15% of gravity, that would be twice the load of the zone 2, which would be up in zone 3, see? And then
You agree that we should be...
I agree we
okay.
should be upgraded.
I agree also.
But that's a conclusion that was made by a very reputable geologic consulting firm a good many years ago.
We've got to move along. We'll come back. Thank you. The final question we explore tonight is the earthquake effects on Idaho's terribly important groundwater supplies. Problems reported at the underground Clayton Silver Mine, located just north of the earthquake epicenter, illustrate some of what might be happening to that underground water supply. Mine officials are today at the Clayton Mine fighting to stem the flow of an underground spring that is flooding the 1,100-foot mine. Mine officials say they simply can't pump fast enough to keep water from flooding the mine shaft. The spring has already flooded 100 feet of the mine shaft. That spring, according to mine officials, has more than doubled its flow since the earthquake last Friday. Cheryl Chapman is the executive director of the Idaho Water Users Association and can provide us tonight with an idea of perhaps what is happening to that groundwater. Just what is happening?
Well, Mark, the groundwater system in that entire area, the Big Lost River Valley and adjacent areas, has gone from something that was in a relatively dynamic equilibrium or a solid state situation to something that's very flexible, very transient. The water in that area, both in the area of recharge, which is under the mountains in the valley, and in the valley floor where the water moves through relatively rapidly, have been shifted about. New fractures have occurred, old fractures that were once sealed off perhaps that would not transmit water now transmit water. And this is what we find in the mine site, in many of the wells, and many of the areas where fractures have occurred along the valley wall, where we now have springs that we didn't. The earth has been fractured, it's been broken, providing new conduits for groundwater movement.
And at least in one case, there's a dry stream bed where there used to be water.
That's right. The Warm Springs Creek has dried up entirely, where once there was about 5,000 to 6,000 gallons per minute flowing. And this is not an unusual occurrence in areas of earthquake activity. The conduits, the fractures in the Earth's crust that provide a mechanism for water to move have been changed. Some of them have been sealed up. New fissures have been opened to allow water to move downward. It causes ponds to dry up, wells to dry up, and new springs to form, causing an entire range of water problems for an agricultural area in particular.
So I guess we could see people having what? The flow of wells slow down or increase in some cases, or and ultimately affecting some people's water rights, I assume.
Well, this is true in many cases because of a change in the recharge pattern. The groundwater system in the valley floor, for example, could be denied part of the water that originally flowed beneath that area, which would cause water levels in wells to drop, springs to dry up, and other changes that would affect water supplies that people had counted on for many years, such as the Warm Springs Creek. We have a provision in Idaho water law that would allow somebody to maintain their water right if they could prove to the state of Idaho that the water they were now moving to obtain came from the same source. But in many cases that's going to be difficult because many people are going to have to now drill a well to obtain water that they once obtained from a surface stream, and they're going to have to prove to the state of Idaho that that in fact is the same source of water.
I see. Is it too early at this point to tell how widespread this phenomenon might be?
Yes, I think so. As I indicated earlier, we're in a transient state now. Many springs have formed and the flow is changing on those springs very rapidly in some cases. groundwater levels in wells in particular may not reach an equilibrium or a steady point for perhaps many months or even a year or so. So we need to watch that. We need to be aware of what is happening with the resource, but I think it's a little early for people to run out and file new applications or worry about drilling a well, because many of these springs may reoccur. The stream may come back depending on where the earth structure finally settles down in that area.
Right. Well, finally, in the time that remains, gentlemen, I want to go around the table, beginning with you, Mr. Chapman, and just get a quick response from you as to, from each of your perspectives here, what we should be doing now, a few days after this earthquake. What can we learn from this situation, and what questions are left in your minds to be answered about what's happened here?
Well, with regard to the groundwater system, we do have some base data in the valley that was collected years ago. It would be my suggestion that state and federal agencies, as well as the universities, install water measurement devices, monitoring devices in wells and so forth, to try to obtain data on the transient state from where it was in the past through the transient state to where it's going to finally end up. This is going to provide us with some valuable information on what happens in an area of seismic activity.
Time to gather data, in other words. Mr. Lombard, what's your prescription for what we should be doing?
Well, I think a tightening of the Uniform Building Code, seismic zone definitions, and upgrading Idaho from a Zone 2 to a Zone 3, which we can do. We have to go by what's in the code. Any city can upgrade it to the next level by their own option, or the state of Idaho can. I think requiring building departments to actually have a stamped set of drawings that say that they were either prepared by a licensed architect or engineer. I'm on the state licensing board, and we have quite a bit of problem with the communities around the state, actually building departments in the state on smaller towns accepting drawings and so forth from for public buildings, which are required by state law to actually be engineered and by a licensed architect or engineer, and actually they have no stamps on them by anyone. So we need to, kind of get a handle on that sort of thing, I think.
Professor Wood, from your perspective?
Agree more with the two former comments. I might say we sent 2 teams out today, and a research hydrologist is joining us tomorrow to set up weirs and gauging stations. All volunteer labor and money out of our own pockets so far, but we're looking very hard for funding to do those water level measurements and spring monitoring and interviewing that's very necessary.
So you're saying that, just in a nutshell, this is an opportunity to gather some information that we might not have an opportunity to
absolutely.
gather for a long
As Cheryl said, we're in a transient state with regard to a major disruption of the groundwater system. This has never been documented, for one thing, in the scientific literature, and so as we ask these practical questions now, what's going to happen, I'll have to say that nobody knows, because nobody ever collected the data before.
Okay, General Brooks, do you have any disagreements in 15 seconds with any of that?
Not a bit. We'll continue to address the people problems and get whatever aid is available for the people in that area.
Well, gentlemen all, we thank you very much for joining us tonight. Mr. Chapman, Mr. Lombard, Professor Wood, and General Brooks, thank you. That's our time for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow. I'm Mark Johnson. Good night.
The funding for this program is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Friends of 4, 10, and 12.